What do you guys think are current stressors facing farmers or rural families today?
I'll kick it off. I think there are a variety of stresses and mental challenges facing farmers today. Range from financial challenges to pricing for the product you produce. The climate is constantly changing. There are so many variables that it could keep you off balance. But I think one of the things that I face is I normally have a really good handle on, the things that I have control over. It's when those pop-up situations occur, especially the financial ones, because I'm operating on such a strict budget. When something unexpectedly happens, that's whenever the stress or the challenges will be increased. But overall, I think that the variety of challenges that you face could present some real stresses for us in this environment.
There's a lot of stress factors in, I would say, the challenges of weather, the commodity prices, everyday fuel prices. What's against a farmer? Everything. Brokers, how many times have you heard the story of a broker, taking a farmer's load of watermelons and say, oh, these just aren't any good, and they might be sitting in New York. They said, all we can give you is this. And the farmer has to concede and take what he can get. And I think it's the only industry that I know of where a person doesn't price their own goods. So I would say that's kind of a factor to it as well.
Well, you take it a step further than that, you also get into the things outside the farm, public perception, politics, things that we have no control over, but they impact us tremendously to the point that we don't even watch the news anymore because we don't want to see. And that's not being derogatory, it's just you have to learn to mitigate those things that do stress you, and that's the way to do it. And the things y'all mentioned are most definitely, but public, every time you turn around, there's somebody got a target on our back for something we're not doing, but they forget that we're actually, their best interest is at heart and every day when we get up and every night when we go to bed, because we do produce the best and most, the safest products in the world.
Your family suffers. I mean, us being married, you better have a strong marriage if you're going to have a farmer in it. Yeah. Or if you're going to run a farm, you better have a strong marriage with good communication. Someone to talk to, someone that's got your back, someone you can call any time of the day.
From where we sit in Thomas County, I see immense pressure to the generations coming on to keep that farm in a generational farm. That has to be immense. When you've got all these factors just bearing down on you, and you don't want to be that one that says, we can't do this anymore. We have to come up with something different. To me, financial has all this ripple, like you were saying, a ripple effect, but this the generational farming, while it's wonderful, people don't realize that it's also a lot of pressure, which creates enormous stress.
What do you guys do? There is too much stress. Are there other things that you have found particularly helpful?
Well, I will speak to that and kind of go back to one of the first things that was mentioned is the weather, which is a huge concern in the agricultural industry that never goes away. It's a day-by-day thing, and of course, just recently we had a hurricane that hit Valdosta, which is where I am, where our property is, and so we experienced a loss. One of the losses was some young planted pine that I had, 6-year-old planted pine, that are too big to stake. We've done that before with a hurricane when they were smaller, but these are too big to stake, and the sun's not going to correct them. That's where we are with these trees. And I absolutely did not know what I'm going to do. And they, we had plans of eventually raking straw under these trees, but we've got a big loss. I go back to, there's a scripture in Proverbs that says a wise man seeks the counsel of many, and to me that's probably the best thing you can do, because this was one of those situations, and you just talk to people, and you just, when you're in a situation like that, you don't know what to do, and people can give you some good advice, and people that have experienced things like this, and so
it sounds
that's
like
what I do.
It sounds like trusting other farmers and your friends, your colleagues, your peers.
I think at the end of the day, we get in this bubble thinking we're the only ones in this storm we're in as we go through things. The biggest disaster I ever made, I've been in this 30 plus years, and the biggest disaster I ever made early on was not realizing that if I'd opened my mouth and said something to my neighbor, they probably were experiencing the same thing. One of the biggest tools that we don't utilize as producers is our neighbors. And we spend in what I do, we spend a lot of time in the windshield of a piece of equipment or truck or whatever and by ourselves, but it doesn't cost anything to pick up the phone and call your neighbor and say, hey man, are you doing all right today? There's always an opportunity, and there's always somebody to network with to realize that you're not there by yourself. And together we'll get through everything we deal with. And that's something lacking in farming now, is the community that used to be there, because we've gotten so large, so time everything is crunching now. I think that's something we got to go back to. Just reaching out to somebody next door and saying, hey, or next door could be 100 miles, it could be Pelham. If I had your number, I might call and say, hey man, how you doing?
I think y'all made some friends today, right?
Or South Georgia, hey, how you doing down there in Berrien County? But, but it's an opportunity to reach out and say, hey, the world's a small place now. It's always been small, but it's smaller.
What do you see from your congregants or from folks coming in? Do you see a lot of the stressors that these guys have talked about? Are you seeing different things?
When it comes to communication and being able to be vulnerable with one another, very much so. As a law enforcement chaplain, I see that. And I think in the agricultural industry, in my experience there, most of the producers that I have met and known through my life, they work really, really hard at what they do. And an old congregant told me one time, he said, Pastor Mike, he said, I'm in the business where I have no control over what I pay for my input. I have no control over what I sell my output for, and I have no control over the conditions in which I produce, other than my farming ability. And with that comes a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment and a sense that you need to succeed. And we see that in different counties, the producers of the year. There's always some competitive spirit in the midst of that. Tony and I were just talking about the need that we have as human beings to be there for each other. And I think farmers, like most people who are goal-oriented, for lack of a better term, you want to produce as much as you can, because you don't know what next year, if you have an opportunity to produce this year, you don't know what next year is going to bring. So you have to, constantly be trying to do better. And when you take all of that to the bank, and when you do come up a piece of technology that you can't figure out how to operate on top of the banknote being due for that piece of technology, it's hard to say, I don't know what I'm doing here. It's hard to say, I need some help. It's hard to say, I feel like I'm sinking. And just to be able to talk to one another. So I think that is probably pretty common in the at least on the field producer side, just to be able to, even with close friends. I've had friends in the agricultural business before where their neighbor would say, I had no idea he was going through that. Yet they'll talk about everything else, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, just not being able to share what's really going on in their life, to opening themselves up, to overcoming the shame, to being vulnerable, and just being able to talk.
So I have another question that I think I'm going to direct to the two ladies. What do you guys see as for women in ag or women farmers, do you guys think do you process stress differently?
Well, you know, personally, I mean, I think women are better at talking to other people about what they're going through. Men are more closed mouth. They don't, just, in general. So I think to me, that would be the difference I see, is just when women don't, I guess they don't feel like they're as vulnerable, I don't know, and they're more willing to be open with others, whereas men aren't.
I think it's more gender-driven, more personality-driven than gender-driven, really, because some of the things that stress me don't stress my husband and vice versa. And I think it's more about our personality, because, whatever you're farming, different things are going to hit you different ways, and as far as how we deal with it, I do think some women are more calm and collected, and some of us are not so much. I won't comment where I am, but it depends. It really depends. Maybe the financial aspect might bother my husband more, but the product may bother me more. So I think it really depends. It's kind of a broad question, and it's really hard to answer it specifically. I agree with Claire that I think we are a little bit more willing to open up. And it took me a while to get there. My background is not necessarily in farming, and I was very closed-mouthed in my previous career, so it took me a while to get there. But once you realize that you can be vulnerable and admit that the greatest thing that I have learned in this is to not only learn from your mistakes, but it's okay to share them. And when you share with others, it kind of gives you this sense of freedom. Like, whew, that wasn't so hard after all, to get rid of that burden. And so communication is key to anything, relationships or business or whatever. And so I do think some women are easier to let that go and be vulnerable. And there's this big, unfortunately, and I'm sure you see this, Mike, in your line of work, that people just don't want to open up about the mistakes they've made, or the fact that they're maybe not doing well. There's this big cloud about mental health, that's a bad thing, and it's not. I mean, when you have a broken whatever on your piece of equipment on your Bobcat, we call the Bobcat guy to fix it. Or, when you have a tooth problem, you call a dentist. Well, when you have a emotional, mental thing, why do we try to fix that ourselves? Why can't we pick up the phone and call?
What's funny about that to me is that there's not a person at this table, if a friend were not to come up to you in your hometown and say, where can I get a good meal, that you would take however much time you needed to direct them to Mrs. Brown's Busy Bee restaurant or to McDonald's or wherever so they could get that great meal. You would take the time that you needed, but yet we don't really take the time to share the really, really important things that we need to share with one another. And we would find, I think, that our friends and neighbors would be just as helpful in those times if we would just tell them what we need.
Direct them to the pastor if you don't know of a mental health person,
Well, and so my next question, I asked this one about women in ag, but what about, we've got two of y'all are veterans, and I just wonder, is there some other layer or some difference in veteran farmers or veterans who are working in ag that we need to know, that you see a difference, or do you see a difference?
The stresses of war and what they have been through, and then to step into farming and the stresses there, I don't think it's a good combination if they don't have somebody that's really backing them in the field that they're going into. And that's just my perspective of seeing what the farmers are currently going through today.
Yeah, my perspective is I was very fortunate to grow up on a farm, went into the military for 24 years, and now I'm back into the farming environment. Some of the things that are relatable to both are the fact that you learn very quickly how to multitask, how to manage risks, how to even come up with contingency if things go wrong. And so from that perspective, I think that having gone full circle, I feel very fortunate to know that if I have an issue, I normally start like you guys. I start with my wife. And then I have brothers that grew up on the farm with me. I'll go to them. Other farmers, I will talk to them as well. And eventually I will go to the FSA and, NRCS and all those other tools that are out there. But I've learned that I won't sit back. I will actually take a leap of faith and go and have conversations. And then there are some things that you don't have control over, like the weather. When the hurricane was coming through in our area, I was thinking about my pecan trees because I had a severe thunderstorm come through and it blew some of them over. And I was thinking about it. I said, well, you know what? I have no control over this. So what happens, happens. So that sense of release gave me some relief in terms of the stress associated with what would happen to the farm. And then the other thing that happens to me is I'm out there mowing my trees and I accidentally hit one. It's just like I'm hitting one of my kids, because it took 5 years to get it up to this point. And I'm like, oh my goodness. But anyway, it's amazing. It's amazing the dynamics you go through. But at the end of the day, it is making sure that that you have a way of communicating, releasing, not holding on to things you should release, turn into prayer. I mean, I've had to do that a lot of times. And those things have allowed me to stay grounded and not allow things to get out of hand. As you know, at one point there were like 22 veterans a day committing suicide. So there's a big emphasis on veterans and mental health. And I think that for the farming community, having discussions such as this is incredibly important to give insights to people who may be struggling in that area.
Well, Jennifer, we've got some new research from the University of Georgia Extension that tells us that those people that come from a traditional farming background, generational farms like mine, they have much different coping skills than new, beginning, female and veteran farmers. They need much different support from us. They don't have that cultural network to fall back on. So that's really interesting. Seems very common sense, but not something we've thought a lot about.
Matt, so we've been talking a lot about trees, but you've got livestock. So and Commissioner, you have poultry. I wonder, is there a difference that you guys see in terms of things that are stressing, that are stressors that you face with having livestock?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is 365 days a year. They're always on your mind. I mean, I got a heap of youngins running around out there. Each one has a different personality. But the thing is, they're not going to get out until you leave the house. I sit here today wondering, is somebody going to decide they want the grass on the other side of the fence today? Cattle are unique, horses are unique. They all, like I said, have personalities. I'm not going to say it's any different than any other type of operation, but it is, all of it's 365 days a year, no matter what you grow or what you operate in, because the stresses of the operation are always there. Cattle are, to me, well, livestock in general have become a coping mechanism to a degree, because you can go out there and they'll listen to anything, especially if you got a bale of hay or some cubes or whatever, feed or whatever. But on a serious note, it is the most peaceful place in the world out there in the pasture with them, for me, because it's just, and you can take people that are stressing about things, or people that'll talk to you, and take them out there and just spend a little time, and you'd be surprised what folks will say or how much they'll open up, because it is that kind of environment. Yeah, well, you have to offer the opportunity. You can have a conversation without ever having a conversation. You know, you don't have to say, hey man, this is on my mind. You can beat around the bush, but if you're intentional in watching what's going on and listening to that person, I mean, we all know the people in our community. We can see how they walk and talk every day. We know what they think, or we think we know what they think, but we can tell when they're out of sorts. We can tell when they're not actually acting like they need to be or usually would act in an environment. And we can also tell when we're stressed, and we can conclude that they're under the same stress we are to a degree. We all suffer the same thing.
So one question for the group, and then I have one for you two. What do you guys think the general public needs to know about farmers today?
Well, I'll speak for forestry. They need to know that it is not bad to cut a tree.
That's good to know.
We plant them back. We have more trees in Georgia than we did 100 years ago, and it is not bad to cut a tree. And a young growing pine tree will capture more carbon than an old tree.
I think one thing also, and Donnie mentioned it briefly, FSA and NRCS are resources out there for farmers, but they're not freebies necessarily. Farmers sometimes have this bad thing that, you know, well, they get all these subsidies and they get all these grants, and I just wish people would dig a little deeper and understand that it's not a handout to farmers. Trade shoes with us for one day and we'll show you what it's all about, or maybe a week or two.
Well, they wouldn't risk everything they have to do what we do. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, we risk everything every day to feed people that are beating us every day, got targets on our back. At the end of the day, the public needs to understand their best interest is in our best interest. We're not out here robbing and taking away from the environment. How are we going to take away from something that feeds our families and feeds them every day? We can't do that. That's not in, I mean, is there an exception to every rule? Yes, that's in everything. But major majority of producers are out there being a good steward of what we have, because we realize that's what we have to live on. And we wouldn't change what we do for a living. We'd risk everything. If we given a choice, we would risk it all again tomorrow if we were given a choice not to, because that's what we do for a living. But their best interest is what we have at heart, despite what the media would tell you.
Jennifer, I think when we hear a term like that, we'd risk it all. Sometimes we'll hear somebody say something like that and we'll run right past it without understanding that a lot of the people that I know are producing farmers, poultry farmers, they have literally risked it all. I made the comment one day, I was admiring one of the big farmers in the community where I grew up, and an old gentleman asked me, he said, "How much money do you owe?" And I told him, and he said, "You might not believe it, but your net worth is probably X amount of dollars higher than that farmer, because he owes far more than that in the investments that it takes." And then when you couple with that, not only those investments, but that's measured against land that may have been in their family for 100 years, going back to the initial question, it's a tremendous amount of stress. And I think the public needs to know that these farmers that they see when they're riding around in a nice truck, that's not just a pleasure vehicle for them, that they're using that to produce food and fiber and timber, you know, for us to be able to live.
It didn't just stop at materialistic goods. When I say we risk everything, we risk our families, we risk time, something we can't get back. That's non-negotiable. Time goes by. The materialistic things are minuscule in the risk I'm talking about. The general population would not do that for their neighbor who they don't even know. And we do it selflessly every day to feed the world. And and we do it at our own will. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. We wouldn't do anything else.
The only thing I would add is what Matt said earlier, and that is the public needs to, I think, appreciate that farmers are good stewards of all the resources, whether it's land, whether it's grants, or some of the incentives that we get for the NRCS Those are all plowed back into good stewardship practices within the farming operation. If you weren't good steward, you would not be in business very long in the farming environment. So I think that's the most important information that the general public should know about farming.
Yes, ma'am. Just the general supply chain from start to finish. Farmers down to that little gal that's checking out at the grocery store. I just wish the general public knew how far their food comes in order to get to their table, because there's so many variables all in between it. And all those folks, like everybody here, they're stressed. So there's a lot of variables to it besides just, the farmers, And so I just wish people understood that much better.
Well, I've been a nurse for 30 years, and I thought that healthcare was very stressful until I got into, well, it is very stressful, especially during the pandemic, but I don't think that people in the public realize just how hard the pandemic hit farmers too. I would come home complaining every day about losing patients, losing this. Matt's keeping all this stress in and not really telling me things, and I think it was during that time that we really started communicating more about it, and I got a lot more involved in the business, and I'm just working part-time as a nurse now, and I think lay people out in the community have no idea what it takes to run a farm and the fact that you put your family on hold for that farm.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say we have a couple of resources in the room, and one is our extension offices. We have one in each county that are available to farmers, and we also have DBHDD, our Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. So my last question is going to be for you guys. You've heard the conversation today. Is there anything, that you'd like to share or wrap up?
Well, I grew up on a Centennial farm. My kids are the 7th generation to live on that farm, and my siblings and I are the first generation that had jobs off of the farm, so did not completely earn our living from the farm. So all of us work in agriculture. I feel like I was blessed to find extension and to be able to go into extension. I tell people it is the closest thing to mission work that you can do without selling everything you own and moving to the mission field. But I feel like our job is to support the ag community, farmers, families, and community. That's our business. So I hope that we are a place that farmers can come to for resources, not just on growing their commodities or growing their livestock, but also when they have other needs. And that's really how we got into the business of rural stress and behavioral health, not something we've been experts at for decades, but we see that need, and we want to answer that need and be able to connect farmers just like we do on production issues. So I hope that you know who your extension personnel are in your county and that you will reach out to them. And I just am so grateful for all those professionals that work in extension that do support the farmers and families and communities across this nation.
Well, I think everything, it's always interesting to listen to farmers from different parts of the state, because everyone's growing something different, the different challenges, but a lot of the stressors are the same. From a poultry farmer perspective, you're right. I mean, especially people getting into the poultry farming business today, I really don't see how that they're able to make it with the amount of debt they have to take on, the amount of stress, and trying to learn the practice. But in our community, the peers is such a valuable resource. We have chicken parties where we all get together and help each other dump birds when we get birds. And that's an opportunity to talk to each other and to listen and to learn. And you're talking to people who understand where you're coming from, and that's a valuable resource, and I hear a lot of that here today. But I also think the other thing that's interesting that I heard was there was a lot of conversation about public perception. And we saw over a 60% increase in rural suicides in the last 20 years. And I think one of the things that's changed is the public perception of the farmer, and what we as farmers believe the public perception to be has really changed over the last 20 years too. And obviously for y'all to talk about that as much as you did. That's something that weighs on your mind, is what other people are saying and thinking about the farmer, and social media and all the other things that can bring benefits is also brings additional stressors. But it's important for all of us to let our neighbors know that it's okay, number one, not to be okay, because from a farmer perspective, I grew up, my dad is a tough man. At least that's the view you have of him. My grandfather was a tough man, for generations going back. To come into Georgia, you're raised by tough people. So you have that belief, I've got to be a tough person. And are farming land that's been your family for generations. But it's important that people understand, it's okay not to be okay every day. None of us are perfect. None of us are okay. And let people know to reach out. And one of the things that we have at the department is we run the 988 number. It's a 3-digit number that you can call and get help from a licensed clinician 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And we're seeing a disproportionate number of calls coming from rural Georgia. And I think one of the reasons is, number one, there's less resources in rural Georgia, but I also think it's because rural Georgians are proud people that are afraid to walk into that counselor's office or walk into that pastor's office because they know the neighbor may see them doing that, and they don't want to be labeled as someone who's asking for help. So use 988 as a resource. Our department has regional offices throughout the state. Use us as a resource, but 988 can be, no matter when you feel that stress or what you need to talk about or what kind of help you need, if it relates to your behavioral health, call 988. We're standing by to help farmers. Help us spread that message to your friends and neighbors, and help us spread the message that it's okay not to be okay, because that's important. It's really a life and death situation that we're dealing with, because the number of rural suicides that we're seeing has been staggering over the last 20 years in the agriculture community.